is really a great personal pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Elizabeth Wood. Elizabeth is professor of Russian and Soviet history at MIT, where she also directs. There's still seats. Come further up if you're coming in. Make yourself at home. She directs the Russian Studies program. She also recently served as the co-chair of the Graduate Consortium in Women's Studies. In terms of her education, she got her bachelor's degree here in Boston at Harvard and her PhD at the University of Michigan in Russian and Soviet history. She is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships. I won't name them all, but they include being a Woodrow Wilson International Center Fellow and a Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies Fellow. Her books include, her first book, The Baba and the Comrade, Gender and Politics in Revolutionary Russia. When this book came out, one of the glowing reviews said, and I quote, "With this book, Professor Wood of MIT vaults into the front rank of the young, under 40 generation of historians of Russia." I don't know whether she's stayed under 40, but she certainly still has remained at the forefront of historians of Russia. Her other books include Performing Justice, Agitation Trials in Early Soviet Russia, and Roots of Russia's War in Ukraine. She's also written numerous scholarly articles on gender and performance, as well as blogs and other publications about Russian history and current events. I'll add that since it has been my great pleasure to know Elizabeth Wood as a close colleague, I can also tell you something that is not always true of great scholars, which is that she is not only super smart, but also unfailingly generous and thoughtful as a colleague, and a delight to think with and working with. So it gives me particular pleasure to have her here with us today. Please join me in welcoming her.
So I'm delighted to be here. We have a fun topic today. I'm really very honored to be here at the Consortium on Gender Security and Human Rights, to be speaking to the class on gender, culture, and power, to speak to other people who have chosen to come out to hear about Putin, Erdoğan, and political masculinity in a global context. I'm going to start with a picture before I do anything else to talk about our characters. This was a thumbnail photo on a video on the RT website. RT used to be called Russia Today. It's the official Russian, I'm going to say it, propaganda news. And it shows Vladimir Putin on the left meeting with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan on the right in August 8th, 2016, after they'd had a long break. This was the first time they met in person again after the Turks had downed a Russian plane in November of 2015. There's only one problem with the photo. It's a fake. This is the actual photo. And I found this a couple weeks ago when I was prepping for something else, and I was horrified. I was really very, very shocked, as I hope you are. There's a big difference between that and that. But since it's central to my subject, I wanted to start with this, to think about what is it about masculinity that has to do with dominance. Does that need to be out of the way? What is it about the performance of masculinity that is playing such a huge role in a global context? What is it about official news agency like RT that they want to make Putin look like the bigger man? This actually almost makes him taller than Erdoğan, who's significantly taller than him. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to think about gender, politics, what is the political, what is gender, and especially how does political masculinity work? And I want to stress that I make a big distinction between political masculinity, which is masculinity performed for political purposes, from the ordinary many varieties of masculinity. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But that's the general focus. And I want to make one other very interesting intro comment about that also comes from RT. This past weekend, as many of you know, Russian President Vladimir Putin was just re-elected overwhelmingly by 76.69% of the vote. And the editor-in-chief of RT, Margarita Simonyan, tweeted right after this, Before, he was just our president and he could be replaced. Now he is our leader. And the word she used was vождь, which in Russian means not the role of a person, the president, but the identity of a person. The vождь is the leader. It's exactly etymologically, in terms of the structure of the word, the same as Führer in German or Duce in Italian. So the one who leads the people. It doesn't have to do with which office you hold or how you were elected. You are above all of those trivial things like elections. So now he is our leader, our vождь, and we will not change him. And we will not let anyone change him. And you did this with your own hands. She says this to the voters. И поменять мы не дадим. Вы это сделали своими руками. You did this with your very own hands. Okay, so this work that I'm going to present today was initially some stuff that I've been doing with a colleague, Betül Balkan-Ekşi, who is a postdoc at Northeastern and was originally my graduate student in the Graduate Consortium in Women's Studies. And so it's a wonderful story of how you meet someone as a graduate student and then you realize that you have so much to work together. She works on the Erdoğan part of it, and with her permission, I'm presenting a very tiny bit. Mostly this talk is really about Putin, but I wanted to show it in a global context so the interrelation between the leaders is very interesting. We began our work looking at the ways that Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President, he was then Prime Minister, but we don't worry, it doesn't matter so much for our story. Recep Tayyip Erdoğan developed extensive playbooks of performed political masculinity. These combinations of speech acts, the way they speak, visual photo ops, the way they look, and interpersonal dramas, the way they treat other people, have served to show them as simultaneously democratic, apparently, because they look and act like men of the street, and autocratic because they seem to dominate all other men. For the undergraduates, you remember that an autocracy is solo rule, like an automobile is drives by itself. It doesn't drive by itself. Well, now it does, but it didn't initially. Autocracy is the point is that the person rules without needing other institutional controls. In this talk, I will explore some of the ways that politicized masculinity serves as a kind of glue that holds together both their popular appeal as men of the street and also their authoritarianism in these domestic contexts. In the last 10 to 20 years, populist leaders and grassroots movements have been expanding their reach on a global scale, and some of you may be thinking about the American president, Donald Trump. He also fits as simultaneously a Democrat with a small d, because he claims to be a man of the people, and a would-be autocrat. He would like to rule solo without bothering with anybody else's opinion. I tweet, it happens. I'm not going to talk about Trump, but you can certainly have him in the back of your mind, and I'm free to take up questions because I want to talk from my area of expertise, which is Russia. In Russia and Turkey, in the last 20 years, Putin and Erdoğan have become iconic masculine populist leaders, drawing on both a certain level of backlash in their country against liberal ideas and their own creative image making to develop new forms of transnational political masculinity. Other leaders we could compare them to would include Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Lech Kaczynski in Poland, and of course Donald Trump in the US. At the core of their populism, meaning that their populist leaders claim to rule in the name of the people, and their authoritarianism, we have identified three strands of masculinism that provide the foundation for these leaders' appeals to their population. In the first strand, they claim to represent the people by performing a highly masculine narrative that appears to make them one of the people, a regular guy, and hence a Democrat. In the second, they develop a public political masculinity that gives them, I would say paradoxically, power over the people, power to save the people, a power that facilitates the rise of authoritarianism. And in the third strand of this masculinism, they appeal to an apparently traditional gender order based on masculine authority over the family and over society. And I would argue that this is somewhat invented. It's not necessarily somehow entirely natural, but it has to be made to look natural, of course. And in all of these areas, they emphasize their personal power as a substitute for political debate and discussion. And so in order to understand this, what I want to say, I think it's vitally important to think about what is the political, right? On the obvious level, the political is who we vote for in political elections. It's politicians and the like. In a feminist sense, the political is, of course, about power. Who has power? How do they have power? How do they wield power? But I think it's also interesting to think about the political as the area of discussion and debate about the distribution of goods and services in society, about the distribution of the public good, and even about the definition of the public good. And the example I often give is that the political is when we discuss whether schools in the U.S., it's a very American example, we should have more charter schools or more public schools, and who should fund them and how should they fund them. And the distinction I make is between the political in this sense and what is usually called the moral. And so I'm interested in the ways in which, and I would say it's fair to say that the right wing in the U.S. has said politics is about the moral because they've made abortion, homosexuality, and hot-button immoral issues come to the fore, eclipsing the fact that we actually have very serious conversations where reasonable people can discuss and debate the political in terms of how we spend our money as a country. So I'm contrasting that political with what you'll see is a great deal of iconic, spectacular political in Russia and Turkey. It has something in these countries, it has something to do with their history. Both of them relied very much on a fusion of church and state, or even in the later Turkish history, Islam and state. But it's nonetheless particularly striking the ways in which this is traveling, and it's showing up in Italy with Berlusconi and in the US with Trump. So what I argue is that these two leaders, Putin and Erdoğan, my subjects today, downplay institutional aspects of the political in favor of an apparently spontaneous, direct relationship between the leader and the people. In Turkey, this is often referred to as the real people, bypassing safeguards, checks and balances, rules, institutions, laws, etc. And the other piece of it that I'm particularly interested in these days is the ways in which masculinity acts as a kind of what Kimberly Hutchings calls a cognitive shortcut, a way for us to identify something without necessarily thinking it through. We see masculinity, and there are many different kinds. What do we see? We see power, right? So I hope that today I can show you some of the ways that these performances, we both recognize the masculinity in them and we don't recognize it. We see it and we don't see it. And what we really don't see is the work that the masculinity does as a shortcut for other values and goals in ruling. On the simplest level, it is clear that Russian ruling practice has inclined toward what American political scientist Brian Taylor has called a monocratic strategy, in other words, a single ruler. He contrasts this to a constitutionalist strategy, but one could just as easily contrast it to a truer political strategy of obtaining consensus, or at least majority rule, through explicit public discussion and debate. With 18 years of Putin in power and 15 years of Erdoğan in power as national leaders, they both had other roles before, it is now clear that both regimes have sought to create a strong identification of the state with this particular ruler. In the Russian case, we say Putin's Russia in a way that we wouldn't have said Obama's America or even Trump's America. It's Putin's Russia. In order to do that, the Kremlin and its behind-the-scenes handlers have relied on a number of power plays organized around and through the person of Vladimir Putin. These power plays add up to what I call a broader scenario of power, drawing on the work of a historian, Richard Wortman, who shows scenarios of power as a key part of the rule of the czars and tsarinas in the 18th and 19th centuries, which is as much through symbolism and signals, ceremonies and rituals, as through texts and doctrines and policies. If you can see that difference. In this talk, I will try to show how the shortcuts work by using the examples of Putin, about which I know a great deal, and to a lesser extent Erdoğan, who is really sort of accidental in my work here. Since August 1999, when Putin was named prime minister, he and his team have been running a well-orchestrated PR campaign to manage Putin's public opinion. That campaign has been based on the articulation of a model masculinity that appears to give Putin both supra-political status above the people as the heroic male, and everyman status as the man of the street. So this is the iconic image that most everybody has seen, Putin as the Russian Marlboro man. And what's interesting is the ways in which that image has a specific time and place. It's what historians love. It's what makes us different than political scientists. We want to know what was the time when this happened, and it turns out that it was just on the eve of when he handed power over to Dmitry Medvedev, and we had an interregnum for 4 years with Medvedev as president and Putin ostensibly as prime minister, a much less significant role in the Russian political landscape. But in fact, one of my friends even told me that on Russian TV, they had a rule that if they showed Medvedev, the president, for 60 seconds, then they had to show Putin for 65 seconds to make sure that he was always there. And this is the beginning of that, this shirtless masculinity to get going. One more piece of background. Masculinity studies obviously are very, very rich. There's a lot of work that's been done on masculinity as performance. Even in Putin's case, there's a lot besides my work. But what I want to suggest is that when he first came to power, he was really a nobody. In Russian, there's even a great word for him. Contemporaries called him bлеклый, which means pale, washed out nobody. He had been in the KGB, so nobody really knew who he was. Who was Mr. Putin? But they then created a mystery around that, and I argue in other work that that's actually conscious. The unknown Putin becomes the mysterious Putin, becomes the interesting Putin, becomes the attractive Putin. But I do want to remind you that masculinities are multiple, different factors of race, class, age, social position, sexual orientation, different political masculinities even in different times and different cultures. And I think that what worked for Berlusconi, those of you who follow politics, we had a bunga bunga masculinity where he was famous for the women in his beds, and then the scandals. There's a trial that's about to reopen on a 17-year-old girl that he seduced, etc. That's not a masculinity that would work for either Putin or Erdoğan in much more conservative cultures. The other thing to say about masculinities that is really interesting is the importance of the way seeing it as relational. You can't be masculine without thinking about what is feminine. You can't be masculine without thinking about how men relate to women. Are they even present? Putin's political image is actually phenomenally male-centered, with very, very few women even appearing. Although there are a few videos that have been cooked up, I want a man like Putin, etc. But those are actually the minority. Most of the time he's showing his dominance vis-a-vis other men. So that's another thing that some of you may have studied this in your gender, power, and culture course, or you may not have gotten to it yet, is to think about the ways in which an alpha male needs beta males to show his dominance. So it's relations of alliance, dominance, submission that can be male-male or male-female. Finally, there's a spectrum of masculinity that men have access to and women usually have less access to. And in Russian, male speech and female speech are identical in almost every way except curse words and certain kinds of crudities. Guess what? Putin has made a point of being a very crude in some of his speech. He said about the Chechen people that he was at war with when he first came to power, going to find them in the shithouse and off them using kind of robber language to knock them out. And if I always like to use one other American example. If we think about our past president, Barack Obama, there's a way that he could not play the masculinity card. For those of you who've thought about this before, it's obvious. For those of you who haven't thought about it before, it might not be so obvious. What did his race have to do with his ability to play the gender card? Everything. As a black man in this United States, he could not be angry, dominant, and shown solo. I went looking to see, I'll show you some of the pictures that I have of Putin and Erdogan, to see could I find equivalent pictures of Obama. Of course not. He's always shown with other people in non-dominant ways because he had to be consensual. Because the American, I'm going to say especially white voters, are terrified of a strong black man. So it's interesting to think about how the culture really matters, right? So let's dive in. That's another famous shirtless picture, but the masculinity is everywhere in here. The watch is a man's watch. He has a hunting knife in his pocket. You can't see it as well as I'd like in this picture. He's shirtless. How many women do you know who can go around shirtless unless they're at the Michigan Women's Festival? You just can't do shirtless and be female in the Western world. I would argue, just a brief overview, that there are 5 key power plays that involve that Putin has used. iconicity, which is including static imagery, pageantry, placement, and we can see the parallels to the Russian icons of the saints and the czars. Spectacle includes events set up to create a show. Some of them he ended up being mocked for, but he went diving in the Black Sea and found 2 amphora, just like that. And actually his spokesman eventually admitted that it was false. Their act was falling apart at that point. It's a very, very interesting moment. So iconicity and spectacle both draw on Tsarist history for the Russian case. Hypermasculinity, which I'm going to say more about, domination and ideological malleability so that you don't have to be backed into a corner. Putin rarely talks about which ideology he's going to use, and that's partially the historical accident that after the fall of the Soviet Union with its very, very dominant communist ideology, they rejected communism. It belonged to a different party. There is a communist party in Russia, but the more they rejected communism because they didn't want to still be the Soviet Union, at least initially. Now it's a little less clear. They rejected capitalism because that always meant greed and people getting ahead. They rejected liberalism because it sounded like Western Europe. They rejected social democracy, social conservatism. Their choices were limited on what they could do ideologically. And by not coming out with a particular ideology, Putin is often called a pragmatic leader, it gave him more malleability. And I think it allowed masculinity to become one of the ways of showing his power and his state-building efforts. So if we think about the hypermasculinity for a minute, I use the word hyper to mean that it's more than regular masculinity. It's exaggerated. In Putin's case, and in Erdoğan's, some of this doesn't apply as much to Erdoğan. The bare torso is definitely a Putin specialty. We don't see it in Erdoğan. That showing his muscles, showing him as a judo player, as his language has been very rough. I gave you the example of, we'll off them in the outhouse if we find them there. He's also one of my, I'll come back to another story using his language. He shows himself as very restrained in emotions. He's a man of few words and actions, which is a culturally Russian masculinity. Dominance through legitimate forms. I'll show you some photos in the military. Interpersonal domination, when he's on TV with one of his ministers, he's always the dominant player. And then implied violence, and we'll talk about some of his language and how it shows those things. So if we look at it, we can talk about the notion of charisma as being something constructed. Charisma is usually referred to, and it's originally used by Max Weber, as something somehow natural, a person, and actually having religious overtones. You had a natural kind of charisma. I would argue that this very nobody Putin, who was deliberately nobody, who weren't supposed to have a strong personality in the KGB, they begin to create a militarized masculinity for him. He's in the cockpit of a fighter jet in 2000, and then he's in a sailor's uniform in 2005. It's constructed with Erdoğan. Both of them actually made a big point of constructing a working class masculine biography. Putin's, we know very little about his childhood except that he himself says he grew up in the back working class district, and he spent his youth chasing rats in the stairwell. Erdoğan is known for having been also working class background and selling simit, which is a Turkish sesame ring. And so here's him giving simit now, but performing that biography that shows him as a man, a regular guy, a man of the people. Here we have Putin in a hockey uniform, one of his favorite games. He's part of a league called the Night Hockey League. Erdoğan playing soccer. And then we see, I just put in Angela Merkel, the head of the German Republic, for contrast. You see that she doesn't look at ease as a soccer player. She's just holding the ball, kind of like, okay, what do I do with that? Whereas they're definitely made to look like strong, masculine sports people, right? When Putin first came to December 31st at midnight, Boris Yeltsin, then the outgoing president, named Vladimir Putin as the acting president until the new elections were held 3 months later, and immediately he went down to Chechnya, into the place of greatest violence and into the middle of a war, and handed out hunting knives. right? He's wearing the jacket of United Russia, or Unity, which was the then political party. But the main thing he was doing was showing that he was not afraid of danger. He could fly into a war zone. I've always wondered where the nuclear suitcase stayed when he went down on that trip. I've really hunted. At one point, I almost found a picture of it, and then I lost it. So I'll find it. Anyway, this is Putin showing with a rocket. There aren't that many pictures of him in military garb, but there are a number. And I looked and found, of course, there's pictures of Erdoğan, the Turkish prime minister, in a trainer aircraft, the Hurkus, and then in a assault helicopter, the Atak, right? And when I did a similar search to see, could I find Obama in the cockpit of a plane? Nah. So it's not absolutely critical, but I think it is interesting. So, as I've mentioned, I think that a kind of politicized masculinity performs work for us that we don't necessarily see. In this case, it does this contradictory thing of making them, Putin and Erdoğan, look like they are men of the street because they have ordinary biography, they have especially an ordinary defined in class terms, and polarizing them, this is what makes them populist, against those elites who have failed to be part of the populace. They show their popularity through repeated elections. This is why Putin has to be elected every time. He has to get it. They went into the 2018 elections that just happened. They were going to get 70% of the vote, 70% turnout and 70% of the vote. And by golly, they got 60% turnout and 76% of the vote. So they got more of the vote than they had planned. It's almost a Soviet planning. They also have attempt to make a distinction between themselves and their earlier regimes, so they can show they're more democratic. But then from the beginning, I argue, Putin had to show that he was in power. He firmly controlled the reins of power. Russia's a hard country to rule, I always tell my students at MIT. The facade of politics meant that they use their masculinity to show they're above politics, appearance of strength. It also hides the fact that they have significant conflict under the surface. In Russian, it's called bulldogs fighting under the carpet. Because if they were, and there's a common perception that if they didn't have a strong leader, the whole thing would fall apart. So by the summer of the quote is from the fall of 2014, when Russia took a very daring foreign policy act and annexed the territory of Crimea, which belonged to the internationally recognized state country of Ukraine. At that point, they stepped up their game to prove that anything Putin did had to be in the name of the people of Russia, that he was equivalent to Russia, and therefore as his chief of staff said, the attacks against Putin are attacks against Russia. Without Putin, there is no Russia. And that's the rhetoric they used again this fall when they were afraid that no one would vote. I just gave a talk on Friday at Northeastern, which I unfortunately am not showing you the video, but they had to get the vote out in Russia, and they did these videos that are really quite remarkable, showing all the menaces, the threats that would happen if Putin isn't reelected, if people don't go out and vote, and there might be, army general at the door telling you you're going to be conscripted. Your kid might be part of the Communist Party, and the worst of all, there might be a gay man sitting in your kitchen, and that gay man you might have to adopt, and that gay man might end up in your bed because you, as a straight man, are going to have to sleep with him. The lavender menace, the threat of threats, that masculinity gone wrong is homosexuality. Homosexuality invading, threatening your kitchen. But if you don't want to have that, and that could be happened if you vote for the liberal candidate, Ksenia Sobchak. It could happen if you vote for the communist candidate because they won't sufficiently defend you. You need the man, and even so I can show you some pictures. This is one of my favorite pictures. Is Putin in front of a picture of Tsar Nicholas II. This was not widely shown. I just happened to find it and thought it was very cool. This is Putin being inaugurated in 2008. The person who's actually being inaugurated is Dmitry Medvedev. But it's a kind of case, if you look at how long they each spoke, Medvedev spoke for 6 minutes and 5 seconds. Putin spoke for 6 minutes and 35 seconds, right? And at every moment, Medvedev, who was less confident anyway, some of it's just personal, is looking to Putin. Do we go down the steps now? do we review the guard outside now? The footage tells you everything about who's really dominant. It was Putin. And Western observers, including our own American President Barack Obama, were very confused by this. Obama tried to connect with Medvedev, and Putin took great offense. Anyway, and this is his re-inauguration in May of 2012. An ornate golden doors, etc. So this all might just look like window dressing, right? Except if you look closely, it's easy to see that a lot of the problem is a kind of disdain for politics. Let's see if I can figure out where I am in my notes. I have so many things I always want to say. First of all, disdain for politics in the sense of a rejection of ideology. Ideology should be a place where you're working out what do you stand for. And if you avoid doing that, you're not having a conversation with your country about what kind of... You can disagree. Republicans and Democrats have huge fights in this country over big government versus small government, et cetera, et cetera. And then we throw it all out the window and say, okay, we're just going to spend how many billions on military, and we're not even going to discuss it. We're not even going to have a conversation. Do you know that a trillion has 12 zeros? Like, we're not going to have a conversation about that because the budget was pushed through too fast. And so Russia, the same case. If you don't have an ideology, then you can avoid talking about politics. Putin himself hated campaigning, and I could show you the ways in which in 2000, 2004, 2012, and then 2018, he avoided it like the plague. He did not enter into debates with other candidates. He just showed himself almost non-verbally as the macho leader. But my favorite, I had to tell you about what he said about the Communist Party, that they were overrun with ideological cockroaches. On March 8th, which is International Women's Day, a holiday we don't celebrate very much in the U.S., but Russians definitely celebrated. Every family, whether you like it or not, brings flowers to the wife. She spends the day cooking, of course, for everybody. But it's a holiday supposedly for women. I just wrote a whole other piece on how that is a joke. But he meets with women voters. He's talking directly to women voters in the city of Ivanovo-Voznесensк, which is a historically female labor town because it does textiles. Going back before the revolution and then especially after the revolution, he's meeting with women in a women's space on a women's day, and he says, elections really don't matter. It's just like if you had a choice between Tampax and Snickers. Now, in Russian, election and choice are the same word, but he is sort of saying, of course you're going to vote for me. Like, there's nobody else to vote for. From 2000, he's making that claim that he's the only one you can vote for. He's the macho man. He can talk about Tampax, which no Russian politician in their wildest nightmares would. It's like your nightmare to have to talk about Tampax in a public audience. You don't even talk about it in a private audience. You don't talk about it at all. And he is the macho man who can say that. Over time, we get the construction of the brand, and it changes. Initially, I would argue it was more military and not per se, not consciously masculine. Then there was a video, I Want a Man Like Putin, that was put out by someone who claimed he was doing it for agitation purposes, for propaganda purposes, in which some women sing that they really want a man like Putin. The alternative is their boyfriend, who's a jerk, who's drunk all the time and no good. And it's a very strange video in some ways. But you create this image of the macho president who's the savior of the nation. 2012, when he comes back, he particularly becomes the savior of the nation in very, very conservative terms. They begin passing legislation against homosexuality. It becomes illegal to have propaganda of a non-traditional sexuality, which means homosexuality, and more to the point, lumps homosexuality in with pedophilia. It says, and Putin said this several times, gays are welcome to the Sochi Olympics as long as they're not pedophiles. And the implication being that all gay sexuality, all non-traditional sexuality is only harmful to children. And he's the protector of children, right? Bans gay adoption, bans foreign adoptions, and begins to really limit abortion. So what we see, and what's interesting too, and I think this is important to understand about this kind of macho leader is that they need to constantly upgrade their performance. They need to constantly do something more outrageous than what they did before. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a performance. You wouldn't be drawn to it. You wouldn't be entertained. And I think, of course, the context here is also reality TV. I mean, it's not in Russia. They didn't so much have this kind of reality TV that we have with our American president. But it makes a difference. Is politics all about entertainment, or is it also about thinking through the hard issues of how we're spending our dollars? The casualties of Putin's iconicity, on the one hand, it might seem, I periodically questioned myself and thought, oh, well, maybe it's just, as I say, window dressing. You can see the problems that if you don't have political debate about what your country is doing, Crimea, they took part of a neighboring state and said, oh, it was voluntary, they wanted to join us. They did have a referendum, but the country was so overrun with guns that it's kind of hard to say that it was a free choice. It's a tricky issue, but it's still an issue of international law. You don't go invade. We don't take, Halifax or a province of Canada and just say, well, it's next to us. We in the 18th century we were one. He comes back, and all the propaganda goes to rah Putin, rah annexation, giant rallies and so on without thinking about, is this the right thing to do? Another casualty is related is, of course, vision and ideological direction, political veracity. It's okay for the leading, for somebody in the leading Russian media to show, it's just the thumbnail for that video, but somebody photoshopped it and somebody else didn't take it down. That's what is interesting to me. Things don't stay up when they belong to an official media unless somebody's allowing that to happen. It also puts the nation in the role of audience, and it also encourages, and this is one of my favorites, sycophancy, which is the tendency to want to please someone. We all have that. We're human. That's what part of humans is. But sycophancy is in the extreme form when you say to your professor, I loved that article, and the reason you're saying it is because you want to get an A, right? So here's an example of Erdoğan with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who was the founder of the Turkish state on the left, Atatürk on the right, and a guard. And why is this interesting? Because they all have identical mustaches. And in fact, the article that this was part of was showing the ways in which Erdogan-style mustaches are trending in in the Turkish ruling party. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it does. If you want to express your more Islamic view, you wear a longer beard. If you want to express your more secular view, you shave your face. But many people in politics have chosen the Erdogan mustache. I had heard about this, and then I had to go look for it. These are just stock photos, and it doesn't matter when they are and where they are. It's Putin in front on the left and Putin on the left on the other one. He's with a bunch of politicians. They have the same blue shirts. In about 2006-07, they all started wearing the same light blue shirts. Maybe it's not significant. Politicians can wear light blue shirts. Maybe it's significant. But what the point is, people become afraid to show a different way of being. It's also a war presidency. Putin has again and again showed his machismo, first in the war in Chechnya, then by making World War II a giant performance fest. It's May 9th is Victory Day. It's absolutely true that the Soviet Union suffered vastly more, 2 orders of magnitude, I tell my MIT students, than any other country, and then all the other countries put together. All the other Allied deaths are nothing compared to the 27 million Russians who died and Soviet citizens who died. Nonetheless, it's the pumping up and the performing of Putin's relationship to that war that keeps militarizing the masculinity. They had an 8-day war in the Russo-Georgian War, the taking of Crimea, and then now Syria to prove again Russia's might. Erdogan, meanwhile, has had a coup against the coup. Most of you know that in August of 2016, there was an alleged attempted coup that Erdogan responded to with enormous force. The next day, arresting 2,000 judges. The day after that, arresting thousands of academics, teachers, and so on. And there's ways in which he, too, is performing a certain masculinity, claiming to protect the nation. We will continue to clean the virus from all state bodies because this virus has spread, unfortunately, like a cancer. This virus has enveloped the state. We knew this and have told all the relevant authorities, we're going to take care of it. When Putin was just re-elected in March of 2018, he didn't even bother campaigning. He was shown a couple of times in very dominant positions, but all they said was, strong president, strong Russia. If you voted for the strong president, then you would have a strong nation. We're coming sort of to the end, so we have time for question and discussion. We can see Putin and Erdoğan have worked together. This is a photo from 2012. This is them meeting in Istanbul, and then this is them with, I love this because it shows the emphasis on the majestic, them in front of two thrones, as it were. In November 24th, 2015, they had a giant rift because of the downing of this Russian plane. It was accidental. It looks like the plane was over Turkish territory, but it was a corner right next to Syria. It was probably pilot error, but it wasn't the first time. It had happened multiple times. The Turks eventually responded by shooting down the plane. The Russians went into overdrive, and I think we should all be suspicious anytime a leader has a response the next day and knows exactly how to respond. Putin put in 10 different sanctions against the Turks. He knew what he wanted to get. And so he sanctioned them on oil and gas. They had some pipelines they were doing together. He sanctioned them on tourism. Russians weren't allowed to do tourism there, which was a very important part of the Turkish economy. He sanctioned them on importing Turkish tomatoes, which of course helped the Russian economy. This is after the U.S. had already sanctioned Turkey. So now, the U.S. had already sanctioned Russia. Now Russia is turning the tables and sanctioning Turkey. For a year and 3 months, they were on the outs. They weren't speaking. When you research this, you can find out that Erdoğan made multiple attempts to try to get Putin to come around. He called him. He left messages. Got nowhere. Finally, in the summer of 2016, Putin came around and allowed the Turks to break down the sanctions one by one. But what it did was it establishes Putin's dominance over Erdoğan, and that's why the RT photo is not a lie in a way. It's the creation of a conscious set of relations to show the one dominant over the other. So just to summarize, I would argue that the performance of masculinity and domination can be a shortcut to power. It's one of the ways that Putin established power when he didn't have any in 2000 when he first came in. The particular friendships and then the ends to friendships, which now we're often referred to as bromances because they're brothers, can come apart or they can come together. They can be a source of threat. We can see how both Turkey and Russia have played a corresponding set of tropes about the humiliation of their countries, particularly vis-a-vis the European Union. The expansion of NATO, the expansion of the European Union has humiliated Russia, has humiliated Turkey. They both feel like they're left on the outside, but at the same time a countervailing narrative of the greatness of Russia, the greatness of Turkey. Russia is referred to the Russian world and all the extended peoples who belong to their Russian concept. There's tens of thousands of Russians living in the Baltic states, in Turkey itself, and other places, Kazakhstan and other former parts of the Soviet Union. In the Turkish case, Erdoğan is fascinated by neo-Ottomanism. Could we rebuild the Ottoman Empire, which had been a great state? And then at the same time, we're resorting to an extremely conservative masculinist politics. Erdoğan has said that while it was good that all the people came out to defend against the coup in the summer of 2016, women really should basically stay at home. That's where women's place is. Both countries have come out with this very strong homophobia, and they're both using the war in Syria to show their regional dominance, their regional involvement. So if we just end with that last photo, we can see how the RT photoshopping of Putin and Erdoğan, the obsession with dominance, the obsession with showing that dominance at all cost, even if it's not true, the sycophancy of the people who probably did it, thinking that they would please their superiors, the complicity of those who don't take it down, where glory is more important than truth, the feel-good aspect of populism. You feel good because your leader is your champion, your leader is your dominant figure. the personalizing of power, the ways in which the nation is represented in the person of the Tsar or the Sultan, as they are both called in their respective countries. The lack of interest in institutions, rules, safeguards. In the Russian case, some of this is they haven't had much chance to really develop those concepts because of the long Tsarist history. They didn't have any representative government. Then long Soviet history, they didn't have any representative government. Then the 1990s was a period of enormous chaos. They had lots of representation, too many parties, and too much chaos. Nonetheless, I think that these rulers play to a notion of a dominance game that has continually to be performed, continually to be one-upped so that every performance looks more vivid, more commanding than the last one. So there you have a small presentation. So I'm happy to take questions, thoughts, great, rich questions. Okay, so I hear three questions. One is Putin, and maybe I'll just repeat them so that everybody can hear. One is about Putin surrounding himself with children in the last election. One is about Putin and his connection to the church and showing himself in the church. And the third is, could Russia have a strong parliament and a weak ruler and manage to survive given how large it is and how complex it is to rule? These are fantastic questions. I think it is interesting about surrounding himself with children. And I think you're right that the key here, there are a couple of keys. One is that they are very, very worried about the demographic issues. They've got brain drain, they've got people leaving in phenomenal quantities. The elites are leaving. The elites are raising their children abroad. The children are going to British schools. They're living in London. They're going to American schools. They're living in France. They're living in all kinds of countries. So I think it is Putin showing himself with children sort of does soften his image. He's also, since 2012, I've done some work on, there were huge protests in 2011-12, and I could show you, I have a whole slideshow. If you want to invite me back sometime, I'll do it. Putin, the protests against Putin made fun of this hypermasculinity. He made a really big gaffe. They were out demonstrating with white ribbons in the model of the colored revolutions, the Arab Spring and other revolutions that had different colors, and they wore the white ribbons to be the snow revolution, was what it was called. Putin, in a very sardonic manner, said, "Oh, I thought they were wearing condoms. This must have been an AIDS demonstration." The protesters went to town with this. Russians are very, very creative. So they started showing Putin as a condom and saying, Gagarin's famous phrase is, "Поехали," let him go. Let him shoot off in this condom out of the world. They showed condoms around his head. They showed him with a little condom ribbon on his shirt at New Year's. He was over and over and over again shown with this condom and they would say, take the word Putin, the T in his name, and as if it was the end of the road, like, get rid of Putin. They showed Putin as the big fool and Medvedev as the little fool. So the masculinity had to be toned down after this. And the other thing was they, to some extent, gave up on the creative intelligentsia of the cities and said, okay, we're going to go with the masses. And so that's where the conservative protector of the nation, it's perfect. He's the socially conservative leader, shows himself with children. But it is also true that Putin has always shown himself with animals, and not, I wouldn't say, in a particularly macho way. He downed the tiger, which was about to attack the journalists. The story comes out, and you're like, really? They surely shot the tiger first, and then posed Putin next to the downed tiger. Nonetheless, I think they have figured out that nature is important to Russians. So there's a way that there are offsetting features, but they still show him in a certain kind of dominance vis-a-vis children and vis-a-vis in 2006, there's also one other awful photo of him with a child, and he's, for some unknown reason, he decided to lean down and he kisses this kid's belly, and everybody I've shown it to says it looks like pedophilia itself. It's a very strange photo. But anyway, I think there's a wholesome and understandable understanding. Politicians love to be pictured with babies. He never was. He was much more military leader. Now he chose that because of this conservative image, I think. Vis-a-vis the church, there's many dilemmas about that. On the one hand, many Russians have become more religious, so it makes sense. But fully, I think, a fifth of the population of the Russian Federation are Muslims because they have large Islamic regions of the country. He cannot be the Russian nationalist, because to be Russian in Russian is to be Christian Orthodox. You're not. If you're Jewish, you're not Russian. If you're Russian, you're not Jewish. If you're Russian, you're not Muslim. If you're Russian, you have to be Christian. He can't play either the purely Russian card or the purely Christian card, because. So what instead, and I think this is why the connection to Erdoğan is so interesting, is that they've made an alliance with the World Congress of Churches, of Families in the U.S., which is Baptist, around a set of conservative values that work for Russian Orthodoxy, which is somewhere closer to Catholicism than to Protestantism, although it's very much its own thing. They've adopted this set of the sort of socially conservative religious agenda of the religious right in the U.S., adapted it to the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Orthodox Church is loving the publicity that they get, making many men's responses to things like Pussy Riot, but then making a conservative axis with Turkey and Iran, of all countries, to say that we are the conservative countries. In the 19th century, this is the advantage of being a historian, I know that after Napoleon was repulsed from France, from France eventually, but from Russia, the Russians, the Austrians, and the Prussians formed a Drei Kaiserbund, the Three Kings League, that they were the conservative religious rulers. Putin has done the same thing with Erdoğan and also the Iranians, to say we are the conservative regime. So I think that's not accidental that he's being shown in the church all the time. And then on the question of, could Russia have a different form of government? This is really a tough one. The 90s did not work very well with too many parties, too much confusion. People couldn't keep track of the parties. They couldn't keep track of what was going on. It did make sense to some extent to have some branding. But I know many people who've said, maybe the communists should have won one of the elections, so that it alternates between communists and Putin's United Russia, which has all of his parties and other things he's founded are always use the verb or the adjective to be united. I think I do have to say that it's tricky. The alternative to having the strong man rule would be to have the strong rule of law. And the problem, as I've understood more and more about Russian law, is that Russian law is what you use against your enemies if you're the state. If you don't like someone, you mobilize the law. It's not used uniformly with transparency, and that creates so if you could up the rule of law, decrease the corruption of the police and the parliament and everything, because right now parliament is the lead sycophants, the lead group that is trying to show how loyal they are to Putin, because they have one reason is that they have immunity. They can't be thrown in jail if they got elected to parliament, and many of them have dirty secrets financially. And it's unfortunately having an effect. I mean, I'm going to stray into American politics. I do think that Bob Mueller is going to find dirt on, because I know how dirty Russian economics are in terms of offshore accounts. If this American administration is connected to those offshore accounts, it's going to be filthy dirty. Yes.
Hi.
Please identify yourself. I was asked to.
Okay, my name's Scott. I'm a photojournalist who just the Savannah was interested. But I've covered Putin quite a bit. I was at some of the protests in 2012, and I've also covered a lot of American politics. My question has to do with sexuality and Putin. And it seems like in a lot of countries, a lot of places, like in Hollywood with Trump and Berlusconi, masculinity is very tied to sexuality. But around Putin, there's all this secrecy around his marriage, whether or not he even had children for a while, nobody knew. And the absence of sexuality in his masculine identity is striking to me. Could you talk about that at all?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer. I'm sorry. The question was, Scott is a photojournalist who has actually worked on American campaigns and Russian campaigns and Russian protests. So, and Scott pointed out, and rightly, absolutely rightly, that Putin not only plays down his sexuality, it was completely hidden for a very, very long time. His wife was kept out of the limelight. Nobody knew. Eventually, we know that he has 2 daughters and so on, but they're absolutely, they're walled off from the press. Eventually, they started floating the rumors of Kabayeva, this gymnast. I actually, and I can't prove this, so I've never written about it, believe that was deliberate. that the Kabayeva story had to be floated to make him look more masculine, but they never made much of it, even then. My guess is that it just maybe not that important to him as a person. But it is interesting. He has definitely not played that card, and that's why I think why I see it more in this kind of male bonding and male dominance rather than this Berlusconi sleep around. There are some weird things. Berlusconi sent him a big duvet for his birthday a year ago that has a picture of the two of them, and before that, Putin had sent Berlusconi a bed that he had slept in Moscow. So, and there is at least one story of Putin being at an all-night party with Berlusconi. So it's not that he's completely immune to this, but he's definitely not used it in the same way that Berlusconi did. If I figure it out, I'll write an article about it. But it's a kind of it's a bit of a mystery. There are wild rumors in Washington. Somebody I talked to said, "Oh, he has some very non-traditional sexuality." I don't know. The point is, I don't care what his personal sexuality is. That's behind, as far as I'm concerned, that's not political. That's his choice. It's what he makes of it. And you're right.
It's just absent.
It's not. Yeah. So the back row and then the next row. That's great. So the question was, most of you heard it, I think, was about Angela Merkel and how does she navigate these questions of masculinity, femininity, power, etc. I'm not an expert, but it is striking. Certainly, as a woman from East Germany, it's not surprising that she was a chemist. That she would expect to have an equal role. She would expect to be a professional. And I think, in a way, she's a good model. I've always thought, well, I've always expected somebody's going to say to me someday, well, if all this masculinity is about posturing, what's the alternative? What do we want politicians to do? And I would argue, though not everybody would agree with me, that there is a kind of way of being a professional in politics, and I think Angela Merkel is an excellent example. You could still argue that there's a masculinity in professionalism, but it's very different than this very primitive machismo that we see in Putin and Erdoğan, who have anger and dominance and so on and so forth. There's even a story that Putin met with Angela Merkel one time and brought his Labrador, Connie, to the meeting, even though he knew that Merkel was afraid of dogs. So how do you establish your dominance? That's one way. It's very simple, but very ugly. So there's a lot more. I've heard, though, and I really am not an expert, that Germans sometimes refer to Merkel as Mutti, so which is mother, which would mean that they're not all seeing her as entirely masculine, and they don't want to see her as masculine, which seems to me as a very enlightened nation. There are plenty of women who have played the masculine card. Maggie Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, who have been dominant. Maggie Thatcher was the Iron Lady, so she was showing she was tougher than anybody. When Geraldine Ferraro, some of us are old enough to remember, was the vice presidential nominee back in the 1990s, the question people asked all the time was, could she push the button, the nuclear button? And I always think this is a good example of what kind of anatomy do you need to push the button. She has 10 fingers. So we're not talking about somebody. Is she missing some other key part of the anatomy that you need to push that button? I don't know. So it's a question. But Merkel has done a good job of being in the middle of the road, being kind of androgyny, I think. And so I think she's a very interesting figure. I think we have time for one more question. There was a tremendous question. Say your name. Christina in the front row had a comment about the ways in which Russian folk tales also valorize the strong man who is bigger, stronger, and saves the princess or saves the nation, the three warriors, three bogatyria. And so to what extent is this masculinity a response to the negative masculinity, we could call it, of Boris Yeltsin in his later years, who was old, decrepit, heart attacks, drunk, that kind of negative image. I think what's really interesting about these two questions about the patriarchal image making, and I, as I say, I'm really not a Turkish expert, but I do know the Russian case quite well, is the ways in which it's become easy to fall back to an imagined past of kind of heroic masculinity, positive father figure masculinity. And I would argue that those never went away in the Soviet period, that you can even see the most outrageous Soviet claims of being the great saving, that Soviet power would save the world, was also straight out of folk myths. One of my friends, Uli Schmidt, who's a German scholar, has looked at the constitutions and says that each constitution has a different folk image in it. So those folk, and kids are raised with them, of course. So I think it makes sense to go back to a simpler, makes sense for a culture that's in a somewhat of an identity crisis, especially in the 1990s. What are we going to be post-Soviet? Then you go back to the Soviet war. The one thing was positive was the suffering in World War II, which fits the Christian, the Orthodox idea of suffering brings you closer to God, and the Russians suffered absolutely unbelievably. Every single family suffered in that war in a way that Americans can't even imagine. You have to sort of immerse yourself in it to understand. So there's that perfect suffering image, and then you have the perfect redemption, the perfect savior. Russia saved Europe, etc., from Nazism. So you go back to those myths of saving and folk things, in part because you need a new identity, for sure. And I think in terms of the family, the problem with the patriarchal model, attractive as it may be for some people, because it seems to give order, it seems to give calm, it seems to give comprehensibility. You know who to expect and what. The problem is it makes the nation, as I started to say, into the children. They're not part of the discussion because father decides. Father knows best. We saw it in the 1950s. And there are people who romanticize the 1950s in the US. And so if you say father knows best, then you don't have to be trained to think about what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to pay taxes? What does it mean what are your tax dollars being spent on? The leader says you should spend trillions of dollars on your military. Well, I guess we should spend millions of dollars on our military, right? And so I think that's the danger is the patriarchal model has this inherent flaw.
My starting point was a little bit more different because I also studied family violence and patriarchal model to me isn't necessarily a romanticized model. On the contrary, a lot of fathers in this model, I think, beat their children and beat their wives, and that is the starting point of these families. And when they become leaders, they start beating other nations, and it was worse. It is very dangerous.
And if you don't beat someone else, then you will be beaten. Exactly. There's a very famous moment when Russia had a really difficult crisis called the Beslan school hostage taking in September of 2004, when Chechen terrorists took an entire school of kids and teachers on the very first day of school. 300 people died. It was an enormous, tragic event. Right after that, this is actually when I started being interested in Putin, gender, and performance. Putin came out and gave this giant paragraph quote straight out of Stalin and said, the weak get beaten. And if we don't want to be beaten, we have to be strong. And so this notion is not one of interdependence. If you think of Liechtenstein and France and Germany, they say, okay, we've got our borders, we know who we are, we disagree over, some neighboring border, but we're not going to go to war over it. This deep sense of vulnerability can create an overreaction of emphasizing the machismo and then the violence, and then going to war.
Right.
And when Putin, I didn't tell the whole Putin and Erdoğan story, but when they were at odds, the attacks on each other's masculinity were flying. My favorite was at some point Putin said that Erdoğan was too close in bed with the Americans and was, I think it was licking them in the balls. We're not talking subtle masculinity. We're talking very graphic, very visual imagery. And so you impugn, you downplay or demean the masculinity of your opponent as a way of attacking them.
So at that point, I was curious about the role of the power. Because they are trying to gain power, and how much is patriarchy and masculinity related in that sense? That is where I am a little confused.
I think, to me, patriarchy is used as a signal for power. So the way Russia really works is not the formal institutions of power, but the informal institutions of power. In Russian we say, don't have 100 rubles, have 100 friends. It's who you know that makes your political world. You can be, if you don't know people, you're not going to be anybody, right? So Putin comes to power in the fall of 1999 as prime minister, then even from the very beginning, potentially the future president. He doesn't know anybody. He's not even from Moscow. He had been head of the FSB, the KGB successor, for 1 year, but he doesn't have those entrenched networks. So all the more he has to show military power. He's going to beat the Chechens. He's going to beat solve the Moscow apartment bombings. He's going to show that there's a threat, and he responds to the threat, and he responds violently. And there's So I think that is a key part of the story. Yes. Yeah. We have another question here.
Yeah, I had a question about what exactly Putin is offering men. So regimes on the conservative regimes make a bargain with men, and regimes on the left make a bargain with women. So the Soviet state made a bargain with women, right? And so it was women who had direct access to state subsidies. And the communist state was interested in undermining patriarchy in the private home, right? They didn't want men to be little czars in their own home because that was threatening to state power. So now you have this, complete flip-flop. And I'm just wondering, what bargain is Putin making with men? Like, what is he offering them?
And I think it goes back to Christine's point.
Yeah.
Christina's point, because then not only was there a crisis of Russian identity, it wasn't mean to be Russian, there was definitely a documented crisis of Soviet masculinity.
Yes,
what's my role if it doesn't matter whether I exist or not? There were women who said, why should I get married? The man who's going to lie on the couch is just another, another child. There wasn't a sense of why you need a strong masculinity. So Putin represents the return of the strong man, the leader, the head of the household, who is going to establish. But it is interesting, it's along with his sexuality. He doesn't, until 2012, he didn't play a particularly domestic masculinity. He definitely played a military masculinity. And I think that's because he needed it for power. But it definitely is a return away from the fear that men had become feminized in the Soviet order. Yeah.
I think the military part also comes from the unique position of Russia in between Europe and Asia, because when you're a kid, the first thing they teach you in geography class, Russia is not a part of Europe and it's not a part of Asia, so you kind of you think of yourself as you think of yourself as other.
I think that's true, and so Christina's point was about Russia being between Europe and Asia. The other thing is that I just was on a panel on U.S.-Russian relations, and my colleague who lived in Moscow, she's American, but she was married to a Russian, she lived in Russia for 10 years straight, without a break, and speaks absolutely fluent, flawless Russian. The first point she wanted to say was, well, to understand Russia, you have to understand the fear of being invaded.
Yeah.
I also turn that on its head. The other problem Russia has, and nobody thinks about this consciously, is that Russia has continually invaded its neighbors. So it's not confident that its neighbors are going to respect borders, and it's not, I can't say because I didn't grow up in Russia, but I would bet that it's not clear exactly where the borders of Russia are. It's a huge, huge space. It's a sixth of the globe's surface, right? It's the largest country in the world. So if you're not sure where your borders are, then borders don't become important. What becomes important is identity. So to be Russian is to be connected to the land, земля, right? To go to nature, the birch trees, whatever. And so then, when Putin also has this expansive masculinity and talks about the Russian world, I think that's also sort of, I don't know where the edges of the Russian world are. I don't need to know where the edges are. I don't care where the edges are. I want to be part of this successful, dominant world player. But I think your point about the left appealing to women and the right appealing to men is very true. And we see it in the U.S. too.
Yeah.
And, the feeling of the injured masculinity. We white males have been passed over through affirmative action, through race politics, and so on. And Barack Obama, that Muslim-sounding man, Barack Hussein Obama, he must be a Muslim. He got all the way to the top, and I didn't. So yes. So I think the other thing that's very interesting to me is we have examples when Putin has actually humiliated other men publicly. But I think the other thing that's really important to understand about Putin and Erdoğan, Russia and Turkey, is both are monocentric political environments where there's only one game in town. U.S. has the great good fortune that we grew up as 13 colonies and then we spread. It wasn't so great to be an African American in those days, but it was, if you were a white man, you could have power in many different venues. You could have town politics, city politics, national politics, and so on. And it didn't matter whether you were in Hartford or San Francisco or Washington or New York. They all had something going on. In Russia, first city is Moscow, second city is Petersburg, and the rest is Glush. You know, it's kind of like backwards and doesn't count. So, and as long as it's centric that way, then what matters is being close to politics. So even if you're a humiliated man, you've been slightly humiliated, you go through the dance of Putin dominating you, and I'm thinking of a particular story, if one I can tell you, but where, all right, so the background is, 2009, there was a big labor strike in a town called Pikalyovo. Pikalyovo is nowheresville, in the middle, between Petersburg and Pskov, I think, or something like that. And it was on a giant highway. It was a one-company town. The people are fed up with the fact that that industry is not paying their jobs. It's shut down. They call on Putin to come and solve the problem. Guess what? This is when Medvedev is president, and the president has all the power. They don't ask for Medvedev, they ask for Putin. Staged, I'm convinced. Putin flies in on a helicopter, which I'm convinced is the 21st century equivalent of the White Horse, right? He comes in and scolds absolutely everybody, every player in the group. He scolds the people for going on strike, but he especially scolds the lead oligarch, a man named Deripaska. Deripaska was also involved with Manafort, who we're going to hear a lot more about as Mueller's investigation continues. Deripaska, there's an interesting moment that was caught on TV that Russians loved. When Putin publicly humiliated Deripaska, he forced Deripaska to sign an agreement that he was going to help the people. So Putin, the savior, comes, saves the regular people. And then he forces Deripaska to walk to him, sign the document, and then Deripaska walks back holding the pen. And Putin says, "You've got my pen, bring it back." And what I think is interesting about this story is the ways in which it didn't matter that Deripaska was put down by Putin, he was shown with Putin. So that we have medieval texts and modern texts. To be close to the sovereign's eye is the ultimate goal. To be far from the sovereign's eye, or the sovereign's body, is to be far from politics. So I think that's my guess about what it does for the men who are involved. And there's also, the other thing that's interesting is there's a Soviet play of women who act like men in the parliament, who are the tough, and I call them Baba Komissari. They are like the film Komissar. They are Mizulina, Yarovaya. There's a whole slew of women who put in the most conservative legislation that is the most homophobic, the most retrograde, and they get to be the tough ladies. So it's about many people getting to act tough. But I think what's interesting is to think about Escher paintings where you can see birds in fields or angels and devils. Whenever we see strength, we also have to see the fear of humiliation, the fear of weakness. And I think this is back to Christina's point about Russia's geographical location. Russia feels humiliated, left out by the European Union. Even though I could tell you, I could go through and write an entire lecture on the different efforts to create bridges between Russia and NATO. They felt that Russia was too big to be part of NATO. Perhaps they should have disbanded NATO. I mean, the problem was that NATO was created to contain Russia. So from a Russian perspective, is why does it still exist when we're supposed to be friends? It's a very interesting question. There is an existential question there. But it's the response is to say we've been humiliated and left out of it. We're the ones at the edge of the schoolyard. Does that make sense? So I think it gives other men a reflected glory. The same way that I think that I've been thinking of calling it a champion masculinity. You get very excited about your Patriots football player or your soccer player. He runs for you, and people don't get as excited in the same way about women's sports, right? So. I think that's the way the masculinity works, but I'm not sure. It's a psychological question at the end of the day. But I think, again, as long as the politics is completely focused in being close to the Kremlin, then you have to show yourself as loyal. And loyalty is more important than anything else. Because if you're not loyal, I mean, the other thing is I think kids grow up with lots of tales about when Russians didn't get along and then they were invaded. So the Slovapolku Igrive is like the clans were fighting and they were invaded. And and in the village too, everybody had to plant at the same time, sow at the same time. You had to be united. So then it's easy to say, okay, if we have to be united, the only way we'll be united. And the other thing is, there's a very common self-perception: we won't get anything done if we're not mobilized. If somebody doesn't tell us what to do, we'll lie on the stove. Ivan Turek. We'll have a good time. Why should we? That Russian ecosystem tends to inertness. Again, it's partially a function of size. It's such a hard place. It's hard to change anything. So then there's I'd say fantasy, but I don't mean that pejoratively. A longing for a strong ruler who will get things organized. I mean, all of Soviet history is about different ways to try to mobilize people. And there are some subtle masculine plays, especially Brezhnev, who loved to go hunting, who had all his, there's a joke about Brezhnev that he had to have chest surgery. Why? To have more space for all his medals. Right? Khrushchev played the shoe-banging Ukrainian peasant masculinity. Lenin he was the starik, he was the old man. He wasn't a macho.
He was an intellectual.
But he was. And he was at the end, very much an intellectual, so he doesn't play that card as much. Stalin, of course, was. Uncle Stalin, the father that gave us the happy childhood, very patriarchal image. When he's shown with women, it's the Dayarka, the milkmaid, who is and the babushki, and so on. He's surrounded by people who adore him.
So I started out my academic career as a Russianist, but I ended up studying Ukraine, and so, between Russia and Europe, there is Ukraine. Right. And so I'm just thinking about, it's just interesting to me how that region, like the whole country, gets erased a lot in these discussions. So one of the things I'm just thinking about is the different ways in which masculinity, a revival of masculinities and a return to sort of a patriarchal family structure that never existed in Ukraine, because it went from agricultural to Soviet industrialization. It just did not have this sort of stay-at-home mom, breadwinner, dad model, which now in Ukraine is really what they're pushing. I mean, they've really just taken Parsons and have decided that if we want to be capitalist and European, which we do want, right, because part of the appeal is a supranational identity, right, that would replace Soviet. But also Ukraine is sort of precariously placed, and so they feel like we could either become first world, i.e. join Europe, or we could fall into the third world. So Ukrainian migrants that I work with often talk about being caught between Europe and Africa, and really concerned about which way Ukraine will go. But there's this huge revival of Cossack masculinities, and so that's a little bit different. I mean, that's different than Putin because it is rooted in sort of, it's still a male-dominated ideal, but it's a democratic group, right? The idea
well, it isn't. The ataman is the dominant ruler, right?
Yes, but the way in which it has come back, right now,
the community.
Yes, is that Ukrainians have democracy running through their veins, unlike Russia, right, who has always been autocratic, right? Had we not been invaded, right? So I mean, there's a post-colonial identity to their experience that also makes this different. But there's this like amazing little children's book for young children called How to Be a Cossack. And I mean, it's like that blunt, And so this idea that women should be Berenia, which is, of course, she is on that the statue in Independence Square, right? So there used to be a big statue of Lenin there, and so now Verenia is flying on this 40-foot pedestal, which is, the Orange Revolution happens under her outstretched arms, and on International Women's Day, the president always tells, reads a letter to the Verenia of our people. And so this idea that women are supposed to now take care of the home and hearth and the nation, right? And so that's the post-colonial bit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like just in all post-colonial, what makes us special are women make us special.
Right.
It's sort of, you see that everywhere, but the bringing men back into families is just very interesting, and it's not happening in this. It doesn't have as big a stage as it does.
And it sounds like it's not as political in a way. It's
not as political.
Yeah, it's always political.
But it can't be, right? Because Ukraine has no power.
Right.
I mean, right? In order to project this sort of hybrid masculinities, right? In order to not have your masculinity questioned and be able to be surrounded by children, you have to have hypermasculinity. In order to do that, it's connected to state power. Ukraine isn't even sure it has a state, so.
Ukraine, for those of you who don't know, the word even means the edge.
Or as it was called during Tsar's times, Lesser Russia.
They would never
it's like a
accept that now.
smaller, satellite area.
Well, they would.
It wasn't even called Ukraine. So that goes into the Ukrainian identity.
Yeah. Other questions about this question of yes?
It's probably moving a little bit more from the general into the domestic part.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit curious about whether you know or if you can comment how much of his hypermasculinity has come down to impacting male at the local levels, at the regular levels, to normalizing the violence against women, the maintaining the subordination of women, and so that would be one side of it. The other, I'm taking a global gender course, and we've been doing a lot of research in this whole thing of sex tourism, and in that research it shows that there is a gigantic number of women from Russia that are being exploited through sex trafficking, and so that's linking also to a lot of new rich men there and some other rich men here that are benefiting from that exploitation. So if you know a little bit of that.
Yes. So the first question was about domestic violence and the second question was about sex tourism, both of which are very important questions. In fact, Westerners were horrified. They recently passed a law decriminalizing domestic violence. It's okay to beat your wife. They decided because they didn't want to have interference in the family. I think, again, it's trying to say that the family will be sacrosanct so that it'll produce more kids, which is one of their beefs with homosexuality, is the fear that people will go off in same-sex couples and then they won't produce kids, forgetting that, of course, gay couples also have kids, either through artificial insemination or through adoption or through a variety of methods. This really rigid notion. But unfortunately, there is still a very high incidence of domestic violence, and once you say that it's not illegal, it's not a criminal act, I don't know on the ground what's going to happen, but I'm a little bit pessimistic about that. And yes, women have been sex trafficked from Russia to a whole variety of countries, including the U.S., but especially Turkey, Egypt. They're often lured with promises of high wages. They can come be belly dancers. They'll be professionals. Don't worry about a thing. And then they end up trafficked, forced into sexual labor. So is there a connection? I don't know for sure. I think it's that they haven't on the one hand, the Soviets, what Soviets did very well was assume that men and women would work. So they haven't gone back to some mythic idea of women in the home in Russia. They can't, and I think you're absolutely right, and very few people know that in 1917, when the Soviets came to power, there wasn't a domestic ideal the way there was in 19th century Europe of women in the home. Women were either in the elites, in which case their aristocracy, everybody was in the home, and everybody had soft hands and no labor. Literally, men were in the home all day too, because they were the nobility. They didn't have to work. And women were in the home, and then in the working classes, in both the factories and in the fields, everybody worked. So that ideal is not so strong. But the question of the sexualization of women's roles. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is I once gave a fun paper at Harvard on the 19th century revolutionary Tkachov had an idea that there were three uses of women. The good revolutionary women should be incorporated into the revolutionary movement. The women who chattered should be forced to show eventually whether they were really revolutionaries, and the stupid women should just be killed or let die or something else. It was not very great. I would argue that the oligarchs also have three uses of women. They use their wives to hide some of their wealth. Mayor Lushkov in Moscow is the best example. His wife, most of his wealth is in his wife's name, so if he's attacked, he can try to keep it hidden that way. Then they use their mistresses to flaunt their wealth. So they're hiding their wealth behind their wives and flaunting their wealth with their mistresses. And then the third are these women who have taken upon themselves to be the protectors of the nation and do these super conservative things. But a colleague of mine at MIT, actually, who is a Russian emigre from 40 years ago, left a long, long time ago, went back as part of an MIT initiative, and he was in Petersburg, and he said, who are all those women? Because he was with a group of men. Men are doing the politicking, making the decisions, signing the documents, and the women were off to the side at the buffet having drinks and standing there in 6-inch heels, absolutely gussied up to the nines. And what he was told is, oh, those are these Moscow men, they're in Petersburg's mistresses. They have their wife in Moscow and their mistress in Petersburg. So there's a very strong sexualization and flamboyant capitalism expressed through gender relations. So that a man shows his wealth by how he dresses his wife. And it's not to say that these women don't have roles. Some of them are fine businesswomen, especially Lushkov's wife Baturina is as a leading businesswoman in the construction industry, which is one of the most kind of corrupt, so no wonder she's a billionaire. But she's a businesswoman. We have to give her credit. There are other women who are in the arts, women of the oligarch class. But what's interesting that I've noticed is that there are no women, with the possible exception of Yulia Tymoshenko, who are ever referred to as oligarchs in their own right. So the term, for those of you who don't do Russian stuff, is that oligarch means someone who has both business and power. They are head of a company that is close to the state, or they're head of a company and they're in the Duma. I've looked and searched, and there are no women who are ever referred to as oligarchs. Even Baturina, who is this wife of the Lushkov, she's always referred to as Lushkov's wife. So you've got very old-fashioned ideas of what does it mean, and also the assumption that politics is dirty, so women wouldn't go into politics, although a few have. Ksenia Sobchak is an interesting case of a woman who started out writing books of how to catch a millionaire, how to marry a millionaire, a sex appeal, but she comes from a political family. Her father was Putin's boss in Petersburg. He was the mayor of Petersburg. He was one of the most political animals, one of the most political people in the Western sense, because he went out and campaigned. He would stand at the metro in Leningrad and shake people's hands and tell them what his program was and tell them what he wanted to do. He wanted to bring in rule of law for everybody. So Father Sobchak is actually truly somebody I think to be emulated. And so Ksenia decided she goes into politics. The rumor mill about why she went in or what she was going to get out of it, very few people could believe that she just went into it because she wanted to go into it. Which is also interesting. So back to the sex, women are either asexualized and forced and take on this superwoman role.
No, more scared.
Exactly. Or they're super sexualized and they are glamorous to the hilt. But there's no middle road. And of course there are ordinary women who are somewhat beautiful and somewhat capable, but the image is either. So it's an interesting thing to talk about here, because I think we can talk about the machismo of Putin, but there is a women's quality, this baba quality, that is negative, but is very strong. It's not that women are wielding violence in this setting, but it's not exactly positive. Depends what you want. You can either have power or you can have beauty. Yes.
I have two questions. They aren't related. One, how does this masculinity play out in the regional governments? Are there all these mini Putins students that are doing their thing? I know he's exerted power over them, but do they have to exhibit a certain level of masculinity, or no, I don't know. And then the second question is, how is the allegations of Russia's meddling in our elections, how has that played domestically into his perception of masculinity? Is he now exerting his dominance over the world in a way that he wasn't before? I don't know.
Yeah. So there are some regional elites who have what? Oh, so sorry. There were two questions. One was about regional elites. To what extent are they mini Putins? And the other question was about the effects of the U.S. allegations that Russians are meddling in our elections. How's that playing out domestically? What's the domestic coverage of that? Which I think is a really interesting question, and I don't know a lot about it. I do think there are a number of local men who play that same kind of dominant role, and there have also been some liberal men. Nemtsov, who was murdered in 2015, was an example of somebody who tried to be a politician, tried to figure out what the rules should be. His colleague and he created reports on what the human rights issues, what should be done about it, how can we change the laws. That's why I say thinking like a politician, where you're thinking about getting elected to do something for the public good. So you have both. And one of the interesting things, and I wish I knew more about this, is that the Moscow elections, the municipal elections this last year, people are saying that lots of young people are running for office determined to do it differently. So we'll see. There's actually, this week's Economist has an article on Gorbachev's grandchildren, and not literally his grandchildren, but the idea that children who were born around the time of Gorbachev's reforms, bringing in the idea, could we have a reform period that would be more effective? The coverage of U.S. meddling, I don't know so much. I have been thinking about the Skripal poisoning, which the Russians have been up in arms about, saying, you can't prove it's us, how do you know it's us, why are you all ganging up on us? But one of the things, so by chance, I had the trade representative from the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. came up just before Putin's re-election, so around March 15th. He was coming to Boston, had wanted to meet me. We run this MIT Russia program, which we send students to work in Russian companies. So it's in our interest to have contact with the Russian embassy, and I think everybody should have contact with embassies. And I believe in contacts. I don't care about meddling. I think at the end of the day, we also need contacts. So he came up. He wanted to give a public talk, and I thought, that will be all propaganda. I couldn't do that, so I would have him come to my class, though, because then my students could talk to him. He didn't let them ask a single question. He completely controlled the narrative. But he was trying to argue that, of course, there was no proof that Russia was behind this poisoning. There was something else I was going to say about that. Anyway, they've tried to deny 6 ways to whatever that expression is, that they've had anything to do with it. Oh, I know. He said, well, why would Russia want to do that on the eve of the elections, of their own presidential elections? And I thought, well, that's a good point. And my response at the time was, nobody's paying attention to the Russian elections, even in Russia, let alone anywhere else. And then I thought, in a perverse kind of way, there is a theory out there, I didn't make this up, that it's possible that Putin actually wanted something bad to happen. You get a blowback, and it makes Russians feel, circle the wagons, we've got to watch out for ourselves. So the same thing could be happening with this meddling. You discount it, you say they're out to get us, so we've got to vote for our strong man because of all the reasons. I don't know though. There's a lot I don't know about how Russian media is taking these things. Probably this is the last question because we're almost at 4.
You had mentioned liberal leaning politician was killed in 2015, I think.
Yeah.
Just wondering, what do you think about how Alexei Navalny is, kind of, I think he's in jail now. I just was curious as to what you thought, him wanting to run and then he wasn't able to.
I mean, I think it does show that the elections were a sham. There was clearly political motivation to keep him out of the elections, to make sure there were enough other candidates. They were going to have all 7 of the other candidates debate at the same time without Putin, so that none of them would get much of a voice. I mean, it's very interesting to think about elections as a voice, right? And when Gorbachev tried to reform the country, the first thing he put in was glasnost, which comes from the Russian word for voice. It's the ability to criticize officials, actually, and it comes from Tsar Alexander II in the 19th century. But can you criticize your officials? And the thing I often try to tell people is that Russia today is definitely not Stalin era Soviet Union. And people can criticize. There's lots of internet. You can find criticisms galore, but you can't run against Putin. And that it's not. I don't know what kind of candidate Navalny really would be. He's been a very strong nationalist. He's got a high degree of xenophobia himself. On the other hand, he has documented a lot of the corruption and shown, collected incredible statistics to try to show. And that has brought people out to protest. There was a set of protests around Medvedev's palaces a year ago when people said, why does Medvedev have all these elaborate palaces? That will touch a Russian nerve because it's so manifestly unfair that while everything was collectively owned in the Soviet Union, all of a sudden, 10 years later, you've got billionaires. Billionaires off of the collective property. But it's again, when it's constantly phrased as anarchy versus order, it's understandable that, I think this is the other thing to say about any country's history is, to understand a country you have to understand its traumas. And I think the big trauma in the U.S. history was slavery, and I think it's traumatic for both whites and blacks to think about it. But I think in Russia, there have been multiple famines, serfdom, which was their version of slavery, and the wars. And so, which have, just colossal toll. So when you think about those traumas, and then the terror of 1937, 38, 39, when every family, 18 million people went through the Gulag. So if that's your trauma, then for an individual to speak out against the regime, and all you have to do is little bits of terror every once in a while. Skripal gets poisoned in this awful way. Litvinenko gets poisoned in this awful way. Nemtsov gets killed on the bridge to the Kremlin. Maybe Putin didn't order it. My pet theory is that maybe Kadyrov in Chechnya did it. Oh, and that's the other good thing is you have a strong man who's even worse and more dictatorial. This man, Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the head of Chechnya, who's actually the president of Chechnya within Russia. He's starting to allow multiple wives, even though that's against the Russian law. So laws don't matter, personalities matter, rule matters. And that, I think, creates constant problems. Yeah. So it's 3 minutes of.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank all of you for your really funny questions.
Yes.
Please join me in thanking those